Thank you. David Burkus, Visiting Speaker Series. Thanks for coming. David is here today to discuss his book, The Myths of Creativity. It's a fascinating look at how myths can inhibit innovation. David highlights the mistaken ideas that hold us back and shows us how anyone with the right tools can find the best new ideas, projects, and processes. David Burkus is an assistant professor in the College of Business at Oral Roberts University. He is the founder and editor of Leader Lab, an online publication that shares insights from research on leadership, innovation, and strategy. And his work has been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, and the Harvard Business Review, along with several other publications. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you all. I have to address this right off the bat because I'm already feeling way overdressed to be here today. So I come from the East Coast. I was born in Philadelphia, lived a little bit in Boston. Now I live in Oklahoma, where we kind of do sort of dress like, like we're country folk from flyover land. And I kind of thought, oh, maybe I'll spiff it up, maybe, et cetera. I'm coming here. And then I pulled in and I immediately was like, I'm going to be overdressed. I shouldn't tell you this, but I had a pocket square and I left it in the car just to feel a little dressed down, a little more like I belong, right? So I want to talk today about kind of one myth in particular, but first to give you a broad idea of the book and what it's about and where I think it's helping, at least that I'm hearing it's helping a lot of people. You don't write a book to get famous, because it doesn't happen. You don't write a book to sort of make a ton of money, because that doesn't happen. You write a book because you want ideas to spread. And those of you that I met earlier, you saw I wrote in the book, let's get these ideas to spread. And what I found when I was actually finishing up my doctoral research was that there's this weird misconception about exceptionally creative companies, right? That they do certain, it's kind of a grass is greener effect. They do certain things right. And I wanted to study, okay, is this true? Specifically in the context of leadership, what are the things that leaders of creative companies do that presumably non-creative companies don't do? And what I found was that a lot of those leaders are in line with what psychological research about creativity tells us is true, tells us happens. The ironic thing being, though, that there is nothing inherent in that team, that company, or that leader. It's perfectly accessible to the other group. So that also begs the question, whenever you see that happening, okay, why is it not happening? So I began to really dig into what is it about these certain people that would just say, oh, I'm not all that creative, right? Well, I've noticed this weird thing about humans. I have a 2-year-old. My 2-year-old is the most creative person I know. He does not speak English, and I don't know what language he speaks. But it's a language, right? Because he'll come up to you and blather, and then you'll say, what? And he'll say the exact same thing, right? So it means something to him, and he's created that in his own mind, and we're still trying to translate it. And I have several nieces and nephews who are kindergarten age, first grade age. If you walk into a kindergarten classroom and you ask how many people here would say they're creative, every single person raises their hand. But somewhere between kindergarten and college, that number drops off. A classroom of 25 kindergartners who are all creative turns into a classroom of 25 people with 2 that might raise their hand. And depending on what major you're in college, you might get no one. Right? I teach one class that draws a lot of accountants, and they always tell me, oh, I can't be creative, I'm an accountant. And I get where they're coming from, for sure. I understand it. At the same time, though, there are companies like Intuit putting out products like TurboTax that are incredibly innovative and incredibly creative. So there's something else going on. It's not really that a lot happened cognitively. There's not a lot that happened genetically, personality-wise between kindergarten and college. What happens is the stories we tell ourselves. The stories you tell yourself about the world affect how you interact with that world. I use the term myths to describe a lot of these because A, they're not really in line with the psychological research, but B, they're really powerful stories that are shaping how people are looking at the world. Right? And myths come about whenever we have something mysterious or seemingly mysterious, and we're trying to explain it based on our own kind of experiences, or maybe the experiences that are handed down from other people. And so this is where you get ideas like probably the most famous myth of creativity, this idea that of the Greeks and the muses, right? And even though none of us really is worshiping at shrines to the 7 different sisters of creativity, we still kind of talk about things like inspiration, which comes from the Greek to be breathed upon, as if it's still there, right? We still go to museums, which actually means place of the muse, right? Where creative works dedicated by the muses were gathered. So that story is still there in us. Right? And today what I want to do is drill down on a particular story, one that I think I see a lot of times, especially in large organizations, especially in competitive organizations where there's this sort of grass is greener effect. If we think of ourselves as not creative or our team is not as creative we should be, we tend to look at some other company and kind of idealize them as saying they're a center of creativity. And one of the things I find in particular is this idea of cohesiveness, and this idea of sort of fun loving, right? If you close your eyes and picture your average Silicon Valley startup, right, or whatever your ideal of creative company is. I actually use a lot of times Pixar because people just think, oh, it must be a wonderful place to work. If you've ever been on the campus of Pixar, there are giant, larger-than-life sculptures of the characters. There's like a 18, 19-foot tall Luxo Junior lamp, right, just sitting on the campus. There's foosball tables everywhere. There's cereal dispensers, right? Not just like free food, but like specifically like Lucky Charms and Fruity Pebbles, and it's awesome, right? And you think, oh, this must be this fun-loving place where everybody gets along and it would be just so much fun to work there because everybody would be so supportive. It's not actually true. That's not to say it isn't true at Pixar, because it might be a fun place to work, but it probably looks a lot more like the place that you work, right? It may not have a foosball table, but, you know, actually a campus this big, I promise you there's one somewhere on here if you haven't found it yet. I see people, well, I know where it is. I got it.
Every floor.
Every floor. I love it, love it. But it's not the foosball table that does it, right? Conflict is a part of even those organizations too. They're not as fun-loving and always cohesive as we think. And the truth is that's a good thing. Because throughout history, we have examples, especially in business, of people who cultivate conflict to drive innovation and make better decision-making. The example that I really love is this man, Alfred P. Sloan. How many people are familiar with Alfred P. Sloan? If not, you probably listen to NPR like I do and know that there's this thing called the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, right? Which means there was a guy named Alfred P. Sloan. Longtime chairman of General Motors, oversaw a huge expansion of General Motors, and there's this great story about Alfred P. Sloan when it came time for General Motors to make a key decision. They're sitting in a boardroom, they're sitting with the senior leadership team all gathered around a long wood table, where you can just kind of visualize, and Sloan at the head of it. He's looking at all of his senior leadership team, and he says, well, gentlemen, because it was that time, unfortunately, but gentlemen, I believe we're all in agreement about the decision that needs to be made today. And he watches as one by one, every single head nods. Everyone is in agreement with Sloan on what needs to be done. So, well, then I propose we suspend this decision and meet back when someone has an idea for why it won't work. See, what Sloan knew is that without conflict, we don't know that we're seeing the whole perspective on this idea. What he knew was that divergent perspectives and people fighting over their perception of an idea, that fighting over the merits of their different ideas, is proof that there are various ideas there, which means that whatever decision comes about is probably better for it. When you have total lack of conflict, like we would envision these great sort of fun, cohesive cultures being, lack of conflict, right? When you have lack of conflict, it can actually signal that there are no new ideas either being generated or even worse, being generated but not being presented, right? Conflict is something that can be harnessed to make incredible products, to make better decisions. And one example that I love from fast forward from Alfred P. Sloan to a much more modern time is this one, Evernote. How many people here have an account with Evernote? So I love Evernote. Right? I have it on my phone, and if you think about the structure of the brain, I call Evernote my prefrontal cortex, because I consider it a part of my brain at this point, and it sits on my phone right in front of my prefrontal cortex. Therefore, it's my it's kind of a nerd joke, I know, but it's my prefrontal cortex. What a lot of people don't know about the history of Evernote is that Evernote was birthed out of a fight. There were two companies. One called Ribbon and one called Evernote. And they were both working on these super secret external memory programs, right? Super secret projects. Not really sure how this happened, but they found out about each other. Super secret project, don't know how it happened. Suddenly they know, hey, there's someone else working on a super secret project. And rather than fight it out in the marketplace or fight it out in various app stores on various platforms, they decided, let's join forces and let's fight it out together. So they merge together, and all of these programmers now are engaged in a fight. Because almost line of code by line of code, they have to figure out what's the best version of this product we can put out. And now, I mean, how many, it was at least half, if not more, that say they know Evernote, they use Evernote. More that even say, okay, I know what it is, right? It has this sort of dominance. There are other programs out there. They're okay, right? They don't have the market penetration that Evernote does. And a lot of people in that founding group believe it was because of that early fight. Only the best ideas won. But the fact that they were even challenged made it proof that only the best ideas won. Right? And now we have an incredibly successful, I have a prefrontal cortex, so I'm grateful for this fight. And the truth is, Evernote, this situation isn't alone. A lot of companies find ways to have structured, task-oriented conflict in order to drive their ideas, drive their products, drive their projects further. Now, there's a difference, I should say, between personality conflicts and personal conflicts and task-oriented conflicts. I'll share in a little bit how to sort of keep it on the productive one and keep it from getting to the unproductive one. But first, some science. I'm a bit of a research nerd. The whole idea of the book is let's take a lot of the stuff that's out there that's been proven empirically, and let's find a way to communicate it and pair it with stories that have been proven sort of in the marketplace, right? And so I think that this cohesive myth comes out of the traditional rules of brainstorming. How many people have ever been in a brainstorming session? How many people have been in too many brainstorming sessions? It's all the same hand. Well, wow, there are some people that didn't raise their hand the second time. I attribute that to either fatigue or you really are doing good brainstorming sessions, but I'm going with fatigue. Okay, so brainstorming has been around for so long that it's hard to actually process what I'm about to tell you, but brainstorming was invented. It's an invention, just like anything else. It was invented by a guy named Alex Osborne. He was one of the principals at BBDO, an advertising firm, and he put it out into the world in a book called Applied Imagination. If you're going to get a copy of Applied Imagination, it's really sort of cool because they're not in print anymore. It's sort of hard to find even a third edition printing of the book. But you have the root of a lot of ideas that are still out there. And one of them is this idea of brainstorming. And brainstorming, according to Alex Osborne, had 4 rules. Four simple rules for generating better ideas, if you will. Chief among those rules is this idea of deferred judgment. Right? So you all know, you go into a brainstorming session, you hear things like, no idea is a bad idea, right? Or this is a judgment-free zone. The idea is let's suspend confidence. Some people are shaking their heads like, yeah, this never happens that way. It's okay. I'll tell you why it's okay in a second. They have other rules like quantity rules. We're not going for quality, we're going for quantity. Freewheel, which means just go wherever. If it seems like it's totally stupid, just write it down, we'll move on, we'll cut it out later. And then even combine, because if you take 2 ideas and you combine them, you don't have 1 and 2.5 ideas, you don't have 2 ideas, you have a whole new third idea, right? So combine ideas. But the chief among these rules is deferred judgment, and that's what caused the rolled eyes, for some of you rolled eyes and for some of you nods that I saw when I said that. And so an interesting group of researchers led by Charlene Namath decided to test whether or not this idea was really valid. Because everybody just assumed, it's been around since Osborne put the book out, everyone just assumed, okay, this has got to be the way it works. So they decided to test it. And here's how they did it. It's really kind of unique. They set up 2 groups, randomized experiment, right? You always got to have a placebo control. They set up 2 groups of people, and they asked them the same questions. In the first study, they asked students in the San Francisco Bay Area, how do we alleviate traffic in San Francisco? And then just to prove that there wasn't any sort of cultural bias, et cetera, they went all the way over to Paris, France, and they asked college students there, how do we alleviate traffic problems inside of Paris? Right? So we make sure we have a quasi-global study going on. Still very, very Western, and we have our own takes on conflict, but a little stronger than just if it were San Francisco. But all of these small pockets of brainstormers were into 2 main groups. And at the heart of the separation was, to the first group, deferred judgment, quantity rules, free will combined. These are Alex Osborne's original rules. The second group, they sort of lied about what Alex Osborne's original rules were. And they said, because they're college students, they don't know anything, you can tell them whatever you want, they'll believe you. So they said, okay, Alex Osborne said that if you criticize ideas as you're generating them, it will be better. It'll be a better end result. So as an idea comes up, challenge it, criticize it, refine it. Right? Then they gave him the same rules beyond that. So the core of this is that. Now, who wants to wager what's happened? I know tons of you just rolled your eyes when you said judgment-free zone. So who wants to wager? Which team do you think generated more ideas? How many people want to say 1? The first. The first one? Because that's Alex Osborne's rules, right? How many people are going with the second one? You all probably point out what's going on and like where the twists and turns in movies are, aren't you? You guys are the ones that just love to ruin the surprise. Yes, group 2 actually had significantly more ideas in the session. They generated more ideas in the session. And when their ideas were rated by an independent panel, their ideas were better quality. Right? Here's what I think is the most interesting thing. In the follow-up to the study, as the students were sort of closing out, filling out their paperwork, receiving their compensation or their extra credit points, they asked, do you have any other ideas that you've thought of since you had that session? and the group 2 group had an average of 2 to 3 more ideas than students in the group 1 group. So even after the session was over, that presence of criticism and conflict is getting people to think about how to refine their ideas, right? And how to come up with new ideas based on the feedback, the criticism. Now this does not jive with what Alex Osborne preached as gospel, right? Which is challenging. And this doesn't, personally, I don't think this jives with a lot of us because nobody likes to be criticized. We're actually really good at it, most of us, right? Especially if we're married, we're really good at criticizing. Or at least really good at being on the receiving end of criticism. But nobody really, we feel like it stifles our process. We would rather have this judgment-free process. What I submit to you is that the teams that are really able, the companies that are really able to keep the benefits of this conflict driving innovation are the ones that I said earlier, are able to keep it task-oriented, focused on the decision, and not devolving into personality conflicts and personal conflicts. I'm not pointing out that you're wrong because you're stupid. I'm pointing out you might be wrong because have you thought about this option, right? So how do you do that? Well, I'll show you 2 examples. And forever, for the rest of your talk, if you learn nothing else from this, I want you to remember these 2 examples, because these 2 examples will show you what the Pope and Pixar have in common. So first, the Pope. The Catholic Church, for the longest time, for over 500 years, had a system in place to decide who would become known as a saint, right? They had a very rigorous process. You had, if you've ever seen the movie with The Saint with Val Kilmer, number 1, you're too old, but number 2, and you wasted 2 hours of your life. But you remember there are rules to becoming a saint in the Catholic Church, right? You have to have 3 miracles, you have to be dead, right? And then you still have this independent panel that decides whether or not you're going to be canonized into sainthood. And for the longest time, they had a process to make sure that only the best, most righteous people became saints. And they called it advocatus diaboli. I probably pronounced that wrong, not really good at Latin. I took German in high school. So what this translates to, you probably already see it, the devil's advocate. And truthfully now, if you had watched the movie with Al Pacino instead of The Saint, you might know more about being creative. No, I'm just kidding. The devil's advocate. The idea was that one person in the group of people making the decision for sainthood, it was considered their job to come up with every single reason why that person should not be a saint, to find dirt on that person, to come up with logical explanations explaining away all the different miracles, and to present a case, presumably on behalf of the devil, present a case for why this person was not worthy to be a saint. What I think is really interesting about this is that this devil's advocate term was not the only term they had for this role. The other was promotor fidei, the promoter of the faith, or the defender of the faith. The idea being that their faith, their saints, were only as strong as this process would allow. Because it wasn't about, okay, did you just find dirt on the person and we found a way to excuse it away? It was if this person, in light of all of the things that this devil's advocate has just presented, is still worthy enough, then we're okay, then this person will help promote, even beyond their life, will help promote and be an example of our faith, right? I can't speak to every single saint that has been canonized into sainthood, but I can tell you this. This devil's advocate practice is not in play anymore. In 1982, Pope John Paul actually did away with this process. He said, I don't like it, it's too conflict-oriented, right? It shouldn't be a part of our process. And so he abandoned this devil's advocate process. And again, I can't speak to who's worthy of sainthood or not, but here's what I think is interesting. From the history of the church, presumably AD 33, right? From the history of the church until 1982, 500 people were named as saints. From 1982 until today, anyone want to wager to guess how many people have been made saints? 500? Keep going. 10? No, the opposite effect. Over 1,300 people have been made saints since 1982. And a large portion of other people have been beatified, taken to the 3rd or 4th steps of sainthood. Right? Now again, I'm not going to criticize each individual saint, but I think the numbers are very telling as to the rigor of the decision-making process that this devil's advocate idea puts forth. What I think is really telling too is that, again, this is not that sort of negative Nancy, I'm going to put the devil's advocate hat on for a moment, as if the devil wears headgear. But we do this in meetings all the time. Let me play the devil's advocate, etc. What this came up with is ahead of all of our decision-making meetings, we're appointing one person. That person rotates, but we're appointing that one person to take on the sacred duty of being Negative Nancy, of finding all the reasons why the idea won't work. Basically being the person that Alfred P. Sloan was begging for in that meeting. Right? And it wasn't seen as something negative. It wasn't seen as that person's just trying to bring us down. It was seen as that person has a solemn role in our group. And because of that, it's not personal. That's their job. Right? And all of our jobs is to figure out and to prove that person's, to go above that person's comments. This is one, I think, as if it's submitted as an entire process, this is one way to take that devil's advocate role that some of us are already good at, right? I wrote an article about this in Harvard Business Review, and I got an email once about how criticism must be a spiritual gift of the church, right? Because it was so effective. I thought, I can't go that far, but it was seen as that level, that solemn. I think it's really, really telling. Now, so that's the Pope. Let me talk to you about one other organization that has a little bit different way, and it doesn't involve the devil's headgear. And that is Pixar. Now, how many of you have seen a Pixar film at some point in your life, right? Everybody. It's sort of one of those things I just want you to work out your right hand, so I'm just going to keep asking questions. As I said earlier, I have a 2-year-old, which is amazing because I've seen every Pixar movie again, and he doesn't know what's going on in any of them, but he just stares at the screen, right? And Pixar, I think everybody would argue, is one of those standards of a creative company, standards of an innovative company, right? To the tune of 23 Academy Awards. I lost count, actually. I don't remember how many they got in the most recent one, so it might be higher than that. But when I wrote the book, it was 23. And Pixar has a process that they use often in developing a film in progress, designed to increase the quality of the film by leveraging this conflict, leveraging these ideas. Every once in a while, sometimes daily if it really calls for it, but at least on a regular basis, the director of the film, the animator of the film, will display the film. They'll show the film in progress to whomever wants to come in and watch that screening. And frame by frame, they will go through the film. And frame by frame, they will criticize it. Some people actually call these shredding sessions, right? Because the idea is to shred the film apart. And then from that, it'll get better. And if you think about it, frame by frame, Pixar animates at 26 frames a second. So basically what you have is you might have worked your entire day one day doing 4 frames, 5 frames, and then each one of those gets criticized the very next day. It can be a brutal process. But they have a technique in place to make sure that they leverage that criticism without actually making it personal, without having such a negative effect on the morale of people. And they stole it from improv, and they call it plussing. Now, if you've ever taken improv, you know one of the fundamental rules of improvisation is always accept an offer, right? If someone says something, always be building off of it. Like the 3 people who have taken improv classes are nodding their heads right now. Always accept an offer. If you don't know, now you've already learned how to be a better improv partner, right? Always accept an offer. The idea is to always be building, always be moving, always be pushing forward, building off of other people's ideas. So in Pixar, what they do is they call it plussing, which means if you have a comment about this frame, if you have a comment about the film, you can make that comment. If it's a good thing, bad thing, criticism, etc., make that comment. But you owe us a plus. You owe us an addition. You owe us a suggestion on how we can make it better. It's not enough just to criticize it. That criticism has to be paired with a positive idea, a suggestion moving forward. And then at the end, the director actually reserves the right, or the animator reserves the right, to walk out of that room and accept or reject any of the criticisms. But what we've done in that session isn't just pointed out a bunch of criticisms. We've given the animators, the directors, almost a sort of a quiver full of ideas for how they can improve upon it. And they can accept them and build off of them, or they can say, oh, that doesn't necessarily fit with my vision. They reserve that right, which keeps it, again, from being personal. But I think the wonderful part about it is we're not just saying this is wrong. We're saying this is wrong, but we should add this, right? I think it's a bit like if you've been in a corporation longer than 3 months, someone at some point has explained to you how to do the compliment sandwich, right? I teach a class on HR, and I have people come to me like, this is a revolutionary idea, the compliment sandwich, right? Some of you are looking at me like, what is the compliment sandwich? I'll tell you. The compliment sandwich is supposedly a way to make feedback easier to take. And what you do is you're supposed to say a compliment, oh, you always come to work on time, a criticism, you smell awful, please shower, and then another compliment, but you get your work done in quality on time. The end result of a compliment sandwich, to me, the very first time I was on the receiving end of one, I didn't know if I was getting a bonus or if I was getting fired. Right? It's sort of vague. I get the heart of it, right? But it's very, very vague. What plussing is not that. What plussing is this needs to be fixed. Here's an idea for how to fix it. So I'm not leaving it on your own. I'm also giving you that benefit. And it works, and it helps lighten that process that is otherwise brutal. And it works to the tune of over 20 Academy Awards in the case of Pixar. I want to give you a chance, though, because I think a lot of people hear this and go, oh, great concept, but what does that look like? I want to give you a chance to try it out. So I asked permission to do this. It's only going to take about 5 minutes, but it involves you being a little more active than you may have planned on being. I want you to grab a partner. And if you're sitting next to this, like if you came here with someone, don't grab that partner. So look to, if you came with the person on your left, please grab the person on your right. But I want you to grab a partner. And I want you really quick, inside of a minute, I want you to say, here is something I'm working on right now. Please don't share anything you're sort of not allowed to share, right? Let's keep it open. But if you can, here's something I'm working on. Truthfully, you could do this in work, or you could do this in your own personal life. I had somebody, the only constraint I'll say is please do not murder any animals. I did this one time, and somebody said I'm having a problem with coyotes, and suddenly all the pluses were about how to kill coyotes. So please don't harm any animals. But other than that, the spectrum is yours. Share, here's what I'm working on, and don't even say, here's what my problem is. Just say, here's what I'm working on. Allow the other person to say, here's where I think you're going to go wrong, and here's an idea. Right? And then switch. Should literally only take about 3 minutes aside. Right? Just here's what I'm working on, here's a project, allow the other person to criticize it, and that's a plus. And you can do what I've started to do in my own life. If all they do is give you the criticism and then you're just sort of sitting there, just tell them, you owe me a plus. You still owe me a plus. Are you with me? Okay, let's grab a partner and let's plus our ideas. Let's see what comes out of it. All right, let's bring our focus back in. That was fast, was it not? It's really easy to get people's attention when you stand on a chair. So I just figured I would. I used to do this thing with my college students where I could not get them to stop talking to start class, and so I would literally stand on a chair and I would do this. And whoever was paying attention would mirror me, and then together we would all clap, and the 4 or 5 kids who were still talking would just be like, what in the world happened? And then everybody caught on, so I can't do that anymore. Now I just stand up on the chair. It works. That was fast, wasn't it? How did that feel, first of all? You got to so you got something you're working on criticized, but it felt pretty good, right? It felt like, oh, I have some ideas. Does anybody want to share? Nobody's killing a coyote, right? So we're okay. Does anybody feel like they want to share theirs? Okay, so I had my own plussing session while you guys were talking. We were chatting about what to do with all of these talks, what to do with this sort of speaker series, because all of the good names are taken, right? And sort of like, oh, we're going to call it like speakers at whatever, but we can't do that because Google's taken, right? And I said, yeah, but the at symbol is overused in technology all the time. You can't do it. My plus, use the ampersand. So this is on video, it's on record. If you guys start doing Microsoft, ampersand, whomever, I came up with it, right? It's December 18th, 2007, and I am officially placing that idea into Creative Commons. You can have it. I'll find something else. Or you could use a plus. Right? Okay. Now I like that idea better. Truthfully, I like the elegance of the ampersand. That's all it is. It's underutilized. Anyway, here's what I think is great is a lot of you said it felt good, right? If you can be on the receiving end of criticism, if it is that sort of plus, right? The truth is that we don't really work this way very often. We look at those sort of outstandingly creative companies and we feel like everybody should always get along. We feel like if we're having a lot of conflicts, if people are shooting down our ideas a lot, we feel like that's a signal that maybe we need to move on to somewhere where people will be more accepting of me, et cetera. The truth is that we're inherently good at criticism. There's a whole other myth in the book that I sort of talk about that explains, I think, where a lot of our judgments and criticisms come from. But that's not the point. The point today is that I don't think there's any company out there that is devoid of conflict. If they are, it's actually a pretty good sign that they're on their way out, right? I can't see into the boardrooms of General Motors over the last 20 years, but I would bet you that at a certain point in time, they probably didn't resemble the boardrooms of Alfred P. Sloan. There probably was not enough people cultivating necessary conflict. See, what Sloan knew, I think, is genius. It's what the animators and the directors of Pixar knew. And it's what, truthfully, the church knew for a long time. And that is, if you really want to push ideas forward, it's not enough just to have lots of ideas, judgment-free zone, and then just pick one. They have to go through a process of refinement, a process of, there's an amazing freedom in the word beta, because essentially what you're doing is you're inviting conflict, you're inviting criticism, but you're saying don't hold it against us, don't make it personal, because we're working on it. Right? And so what all of these groups have found a way to do is to structure that in a way that's always channeling it towards building. Right? And so what I would submit to you today, as you go from wherever it is if you're having a problem anywhere in your sort of life, what we're trained to do is to find out people who will sympathize with us. Find out people who tell us, oh, it'll get better, right? Everything happens for a reason. Some things don't happen for a reason, right? But we say everything happens for a reason, it'll get better, right? This too shall pass, whatever we want to use. Well, what we really probably need is someone dressed up in the devil's headgear saying, no, here's why it's not going to work. And then adding plus, but hey, if you did this, this would actually work, right? I've had it for like 8 years. I call her Jana, she's my wife. She does a really good job of that. When we started out, we were very, very conflict oriented, and we have shifted to being very, very conflict for the sake of structure, right? We both have very, very A personalities, and so when we fight a lot, it's like, but when we put it together, there's no end to where it goes, right? So if you're stuck somewhere, what I would submit to you is don't look for greener pastures, don't look for more cohesion. Instead, go the opposite way. See if you can't find a devil's advocate, and see if together you two can't plus your way forward to being more creative and more innovative. So I know we covered sort of a lot of different stuff. I got a little nerdy on research, took you on a history of the Catholic Church, even talked about Pixar and General Motors and Evernote. What questions do you have for me? Yeah?
What if conflict leads to people disrespecting each other?
So, yes, and the larger question I get inside of this. So the question was, what if conflict leads to people disrespecting each other? What I feel like a lot of times is basically, the same question is, hey, these ideas are great, how? How do we change our culture to where it doesn't devolve into personality? And this is where the real key behind, there's no magic research behind why the devil's advocate works or why plussing works. The real key to why they work is you're submitting yourself to a process. Other people use a different one that doesn't necessarily jive with the research much, called Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats. And the idea is if everybody's wearing a certain hat, that's their job, we're not going to hold it against them. So the idea is to just keep it focused on the job. And this is where I think especially a facilitator in kind of the brainstorming sessions are really important for saying, no, that's personality criticism, we're not doing that right now. And where I think, though, plussing works is kind of improvisationally without a facilitator, because you can look back at someone and say, hey, that's great, but you owe me a plus. You owe me a way to get it sort of better. So how do you change an overall culture into one where it doesn't devolve into that? It takes a lot of time, and it takes getting people a little bit more familiar with the process. It takes little experiments like we did today to where now we have a room full of people going, okay, I know this can work. I just need to sort of roll it out and refine it and get more used to it. So I wish there was sort of a magic do this, and there will never be any personality conflict. It takes some time to get people adopted to this. Pixar certainly had an advantage because they've been doing it from the very beginning. So I suppose same thing with the Catholic Church, although now they might have a hard time going back to it, right? But it's about trusting that process and really using that as your excuse, and that's your out, right? That I'm just submitting myself to a process. Because I think a lot of times where it gets personal is because it's something that was said that wasn't personal, but it got inherently taken as it, and then the response back is what's the actual personal one. And so as long as you can say that initial criticism with no, it's just about the process, it's just what my duty is to do, you can usually cut a lot of that out. Now, that said, there's always that person that's just crazy, critical, awful person to be around. They don't get a lot of Christmas cards, right? You don't want them. I'm looking at the shirt over here. You would want to mark them as spam, right? Love it. Just don't let that person be the devil's advocate for a while. Right? Let some other more positive people be it as you're learning how to use the process. And then maybe give them a shot, or maybe never give them a shot. They're already the devil's advocate, right? We don't need to beify them as one. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
So this is kind of more specific about plussing, but
okay.
There are certain scenarios where you can identify a problem with an idea, but maybe not have a solution for it. Does that mean you should not present the problem, or, I mean, how should you go about that?
So in the book, I talk about this other myth called the brainstorming myth, which is essentially that whenever we have a problem, let's just get in a room, throw out a bunch of ideas, we'll pick the best one, right? And what plussing, I think, is a part of is that ideation area. But the truth is, the reason I call it a myth is that that's great, but it has to be part of this larger process, right? Albert Einstein once said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes structuring the question properly. Right? Which really speaks to the amount of research and definition and refinement of the problem that needs to go into before you get into the brainstorming sessions. So a lot of times when you can't think of ideas or you can't think of ideas that work, it's time to just circle back and go, okay, clearly we don't have the right problem, and let's just move backward a step and do more research until we can figure out the problem. Make sense? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. I love that, by the way. You're free to steal that too, the 55 and 1. It makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. Because if you want, so you go from Albert Einstein to, I think Tony Robbins once said, if you want a better answer, ask a better question, right? Which I'll go with Einstein's because he's Einstein. But both are the same perspectives on the idea. How you structure the question matters. And if you're not getting the answers you want, take a step back and see if you're asking the right question. Other thoughts, questions? Other people who want to ask the right question?
What if conflict leads to deadlock?
What if it leads, as in there's nowhere to go forward?
Nowhere to go, or take Congress, for example.
Where would you like me to take them? Because I know where I'd like to take them. So I think what is genius to the plussing methodology, and I would say that first the devil's advocate approach would basically be if there is conflict and there's deadlock, clearly the person is just not good enough, right? And so deadlock almost has a purpose. Right? The plussing mentality, basically, the larger process that Pixar goes through is remember that the director, the animator, reserves the right to accept or reject that criticism. So what the director gets exposed to, what the animators get exposed to, are all of these different ideas. And even if there's deadlock, they still have a right to leave the room with whatever ideas they want and leave whatever ideas they don't want in the room. And so I think that basically says, okay, even if there's deadlock, there's one person ultimately that pulls it forward. And we're all submitting to helping them. So even if there's 4 people who say this and 4 people who say this, that one person who actually gets the decision-making authority, it rests with them, and we're all submitting to the process of helping them get better, so we're all okay with whatever they decide. And I think, truthfully, to say Congress, I think if we had that sort of mentality a bit more, that we're here to provide different perspectives on an issue, but ultimately certain sort of people. There was something about checks and balances where this was supposed to happen, right? Where ultimately there were certain people that could sort of help with that. But it doesn't necessarily work out that way. The other thing I should say is that Pixar employees know that they'll be there for longer than 2 years, and they don't have to, cozy up to their boss at the end of that 2-year cycle to get rehired. So I think it helps them make tough decisions. But anyway, yeah.
Research did you figure out how this process actually worked? Because, if I'm the animator and I can go out of the room and still do whatever I wanted to do before I entered the room and listen to my criticism, my personality type tells me, I'll listen to your criticism, I'll go back and do exactly what I want to do before I entered the room. Well, so did you get any feedback on whether they, took the suggestions or not?
So I would suggest that you may not be the right animator for their process, and you might have more fun at DreamWorks ripping off fairy tales. Oh, that was mean, because that's the same thing Disney does, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, so I'd submit that. I think in general, I think you have to come with the mentality that these people are here to help. They're not just here to criticize, they're here to sort of point things out. And the truth is, all of us have situations in our lives where this is what happens in these sessions more often, where we're not capable of seeing certain problems that we have and certain criticisms that we have, right? Everyone who has a Facebook profile or a Twitter profile automatically has this vision of them as a little bit better than they really are, right? And so there are people who are in your very real life that need to remind you that your selfie is not an accurate reflection of you, right? That your actual self is different from your selfie. That's good. I like that. Just came up with that on the fly. And so I think this is where that process comes in. Is it's an opportunity to say, yeah, here is my vision, but I want to make it better, so point out what I'm missing. And when you come in with that attitude of that, you can really benefit from this. If you're not willing to come into that attitude with that, then you probably won't last very long as a part of their organization as a whole. And they're not afraid to change it up and move around and change different directors. I'm a big fan of, actually, one of my favorite Pixar films is The Invincibles. And The Invincibles came about when all of their directors sort of had their rhythm down. And what they decided to do is kind of throw a wild card in there. And they hired Brad Bird, who had previously directed The Iron Giant. It was a wonderful film, but it was a total box office flop. And they brought him in and basically said, we need to shake up our process a bit. And so the team that he built, et cetera, was willing to sort of push that forward. That's the story that gets circulated around, because that's the right sort of attitude that they want to cultivate. Is nobody's perfect, everybody can get better. And if you think you're perfect, we'll find somebody else. I saw that one first, but I'll catch you in a second.
I have a question on when you talk about criticize during the brainstorming session. So could you give some practical tips how to do that? Because what I realized is we have tried that. A lot of the time we go into the criticize, go into a 10-minute debate. Because one person really wants to explain the idea and they keep developing on each other. So you can give more people to really contribute. And then so how did you really facilitate the whole brainstorming session, ask everybody to contribute at the same time, creating those good conflicts?
Yeah, so the question is basically how do we incorporate criticism into that brainstorming session to where it doesn't just devolve into two people arguing the whole time and everybody else just sits there wondering what are they going to do. This was not in the study, but comes out of sort of my personal experiences. I think there's a variety of phases to an ideation session, and I often use the term ideation because it makes me sound cool, but also because a couple of people get, yeah, I know, but brainstorming, here's the thing, brainstorming is so overused, people walk in assuming they want something, and so I talk about idea generation sessions, ideation sessions, whatever you want to call it. What I actually think is there has to be sort of phases. So when I go in and work with companies and with nonprofits sort of on a one-on-one, I actually usually start the session with individual writing time. Because I promise you, if you have more than two people in the room, one of them's probably going to be a little bit more introverted tendency, and they get shot over in a sense and talked over. So I want to give them time to write down their ideas. Then we get into sort of group, and as criticisms come up, we sort of, some teams have probably done this before. You have sort of a parking lot. Our parking lot is only for sort of demolition derby parking lot, right? It's only for criticism ideas. The thing is, throw them all out there, and then when we're done throwing them all out there and we have a full parking lot, then turn by turn we go into these different criticisms. And you might still find you have to spend too much time on one individual criticism in the parking lot, but at least all of the initial ideas have been gotten out. And at this point, we're going through the parking lot and seeing what new ideas come out of that criticism and finding a place to put those on. So different phases is kind of how I handle it. So, yeah.
We're talking about the process when you have a bunch of people in a room and how to do things. What I have seen people struggle with it to understand why people should work in a certain and how to work in a group. And in other words, how to generate like-minded people who are ready to have this kind of discussion. Right? We are talking about like what happens if something goes wrong in a particular discussion, how to handle it. But how do we even get people in first place to say, yes, this is a good way of doing it? Because if there is no fundamental agreement on that, yes, this is right, then everything else is just trying few things here and there and will not give you optimal result.
Yeah, so the question is sort of how do we get people to even buy into the idea that it's about the collective mind instead of just I'm going to pursue my idea, you pursue yours, we'll refine as we go, that sort of stuff. There's actually another myth in the book that I call the lone creator myth, which I sell to a lot of people as this is the reason we need this. Or we think about Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb, trying 1,000 times, 5,000 times, 10,000 times, right? We picture him alone in a facility somewhere testing out all these different filaments. Not a lot of that ever actually happened. I don't, for one thing, I know for a fact he didn't work alone. He didn't actually invent the light bulb. There were 22 patents for light bulbs, 22 inventors of the light bulb who filed patents before he did. His patent was for improvement in electric lamps. That's a different story. But the truth is that his greatest invention probably wasn't the light bulb, which is good because January 1st we do away with it. His greatest invention was Menlo Park, this facility where about 10 to 15 people at any given time were working on various different projects. And most of the patents that came out of Menlo Park had lots of different people's names on them. Very early on, though, they called themselves the muckers. That was their sort of collective term for their little group. But very early on, they found out that people would pay more money if they thought Thomas Edison was working alone on their project. But that the project would be better if they all sort of worked together and pulled their minds together. So Edison, the man, suddenly became Edison, code word for all of us, right? Because you could charge more. And I think that speaks to this idea that people sell themselves on, that, oh, I just know what to do and I'm going to drive after it. But the truth is almost every great sort of creative work you can actually find a team behind. I shift from Thomas Edison to Michelangelo. We picture him alone on scaffolding painting the Sistine Chapel. There were 13 other people there painting it too. Hate to break that to you. Hate to ruin it for you. So the truth is there's very little research to support the idea that one person has all of the ideas they need and that they can't get better from that. So a lot of times it kind of takes really selling them on that idea. And in the examples that I sort of talk about, again, to go with this, you sort of have a culture where that's already agreed upon and accepted. And so if not, you have to really work on a culture shift. I wish I knew a way to wave a magic wand and do that. It was one of the reasons I wanted to address it in the book, is because I wanted to sort of speak to those people who say, I can do everything on my own. Yes, you can, but you can do everything better with a group of people. Make sense? You with me? Yeah. I know, probably not it's not the magic wand answer you wanted to hear. I wish I had a collaboration pill that we could just force down people.
I get the idea.
So, yes, in the back.
So what I observed in the exercise that you asked us to do is, the person next to me was a random person. And
Hopefully.
Yeah, I don't know what I was working on. And the perspective that I got was very different and very interesting. So the question I have for you is, who should be in the brainstorming session, and how many brainstorming sessions the research says that one should do?
I wish I knew the answer as to how many. Is there as many as it takes? But as to who should be in the room, probably more people than you think. Right? So one of the things that ties on to this idea of this lone creator and collaboration idea is there's some interesting research done actually out of microbiology labs, where the more sort of diverse the people that were attending the weekly meetings, working on different projects, what would end up happening is when you said your problem, if you probably have actually, here's an analogy for you, you probably have had this. You talk to someone on your team and you explain your problem one way. And then you go out with a group of friends who don't work here, don't work anywhere in the sector, and you explain it a different way. You use different metaphors, different analogies. What's happening in their mind is the exact same thing. They're hearing those analogies and those metaphors, and then they're translating into their jargon. And because of that, you're actually getting multiple times to get different perspectives. And so the most productive microbiology labs as far as putting out research were the ones that had the widest range of stuff, because when they got together, they were using analogies to explain stuff, using analogies to understand it, and then doing the same thing backwards. So you had this big diverse. There was another group of researchers that wanted to test this idea, how much diversity, et cetera. And they actually looked at Broadway shows. They looked at year by year, they looked at different Broadway shows based on how diverse the production teams behind different shows were. So they would measure everybody, and this was a huge project because some of this stuff is not on, there wasn't an IMDb for Broadway at the time, right? So they had to go in sometimes and go playbill by playbill and look at all this. What they found was that in any given production year, the most successful production years, if you were to rate a scale of 1 to 5, sort of 1 being total homogeneity and 1 being total diversity, the optimal was about a 2.6, so just a little bit over diverse. Uniform enough to where everybody's familiar with the process and familiar with certain terms, et cetera, but diverse enough to where new ideas are being presented. And what I think is really interesting is that the question isn't, I think the question isn't how do we make sure the right level of people are in the room, because they didn't do it on a show-by-show basis, they did it year by year. The question is how do we build a whole company, a whole department, a whole team of people to where the people we're going to pull from to go in any room can provide that and be constantly sort of remixing. It's not necessarily about the individual teams, it's about the entire network. How do we build one that's diverse enough to pull 2.6 teams out of? Other thoughts, questions? Yes?
Is there some intended symbolism in your cover picture?
My cover designer is awesome, that's all. I was telling the story earlier, especially when you're doing your first book, you don't get a lot of say in the process, right? And it's probably a good thing, because I would have put a light bulb on there and then everybody would go, boring, right? And what they usually do is they come to you and they give you about 10 proofs and they say, hey, tell us which ones you like out of these, and then we'll push them forward. And I got an email and it said, I probably shouldn't share this with y'all, but oh well. I got an email and it said, here's 2. So immediately my mind's going, oh no, because I only have 2 to pick from. And then the second line of the email says, and I want you to know everybody around the office really likes the first one. Which is sort of code for I hope you like the first one, because we're doing it, right? And I opened it up and it was sort of that, right? Nowhere in the book do we talk about monkeys or little kids. Actually, different people have said this is a boy, a girl, a Lady Gaga. Everybody has their idea of who this person is. I think it's a boy. I've seen the larger photograph. I think the idea, though, is that sometimes we don't really know who's in charge, right? Sometimes we don't really know who's doing the studying, and sometimes we're not studying stuff the right way, and hence the explanations we get aren't necessarily the right one. But no, truthfully, you got to have a creative cover if you're going to write a book about creativity, right? So light bulbs don't cut it anymore.
Well, I want to say thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you all.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.